In the 1960s, the Soviet Union's main strategic military threat was that posed by the United States Air Force's strategic bombers, and the Russian supersonic jets were designed to defend the motherland against that threat. But when the U.S. started testing the XB-70 Valkyrie, a bleeding-edge tech bomber that could fly at 70,000 feet at an airspeed of Mach 3, the pressure was on the USSR's aerospace engineers to step up their game and do it quickly. The result was the MiG-25, NATO codenamed Foxbat, a high-altitude, high-speed interceptor created to keep up with the Valkyrie. To execute that mission, the MiG-25 had three main components: the Timansky R-15 turbojet, which was originally designed to power cruise missiles and reconnaissance drones, the 600-kilowatt Smerch-A radar, and four weapon stations on the wings to carry the R-40 air-to-air missile, NATO codename AA-6 Acrid. At Mach 3, parts of the jet would get as hot as 300 degrees Celsius, but titanium wasn't available for mass production, so the engineers chose heavy nickel steel alloy, which could quickly be welded together and was easy to repair. The steel made the jet weigh over 40,000 pounds, which affected maneuverability, but that wasn't a showstopper considering the mission was intercepting bombers and not dogfighting. As the Soviets designed the Foxbat in earnest, the XB-70 program was terminated after a mid-air during a promo flight on June 8, 1966. But the Russians kept going on the idea that the Americans would develop another high-speed, high-altitude bomber. Then the world had its first glimpse of the Foxbat as the Russians released film footage of a light division doing a flyby during the 1967 October Revolution air show. The West was concerned, to put it mildly. American military intelligence analysis focused on the 46-foot wingspan, the large intakes, the massive engines, and what they suspected were exotic materials used for fuselage and wings to withstand the temperatures caused by the dynamic pressure on flight surfaces at high Mach numbers. Western media fanned the flames by writing stories about how this new Russian superjet nullified at least one leg of the American nuclear triad, the one that needed strategic bombers to be able to reach their targets. The United States Air Force Chief of Staff, General John McConnell, said publicly that for the first time since the end of World War II, the Soviets had a jet that the Americans couldn't match. The Air Force also noted that the Foxbat looked a lot like their plans for a next-generation fighter, and in response, they modified the key performance parameters for the FX program. They also sped up the development of that program, and the result was the F-15 Eagle, which reached operational status in 1977. In 1969, the Soviets ramped up production of the MiG-25, including a reconnaissance version, manufacturing more than 100 per month. In 1971, the Soviet Union sent a detachment of 4 Foxbats to Egypt. The jets had Egyptian Air Force markings but were flown by Russian pilots. Israeli controllers tracked the MiG-25s over the Sinai, flying at speeds upwards of Mach 3. The Israelis shared this data with their American allies, and concern about this Soviet superjet continued to increase. Then, on September 6, 1976, something happened that changed the dynamic completely. During a multi-plane mission off the east coast of Russia, Air Force Lieutenant Viktor Belenko feigned an aircraft malfunction and fell back from the formation before diverting to Japan. He intended to land at Chitose Air Base, but because his navigation was off and he was low on fuel, he wound up on deck at the civilian airfield at Hakodate. He came in low and hot, fearing he'd be shot down by Japanese air defenses, and his speed caused the jet to skid off the end of the runway into the dirt. As he was taken into custody by Japanese authorities, he asked for asylum in the United States, which he was eventually granted by President Jimmy Carter. He was ultimately hired as a civilian government employee who worked at Top Gun as a lecturer on Soviet Air Force organizational structure and tactics. And although he already had a family in Russia, he got remarried to a music teacher from North Dakota and fathered 2 sons. That marriage later ended in divorce. As a side note, I met Viktor Belenko at the Oceana O Club in the early 90s. I was introduced to him by the guy who was my skipper at that time, the CEO of VF-143, who had served with Belenko at Top Gun. Now, when the Americans found out about the defection, they told the Japanese they'd send a C-5 right over to pick up the MiG and take it back to the States for full intelligence exploitation. But the Japanese were caught in the middle between 2 superpowers of the day. They wanted to hook up their allies, but they didn't want to threaten their nearby foe in the process, so instead of letting the Americans take possession of the Foxbat, they let a team come over to closely inspect it. As the Americans went over the MiG and sat Belenko down for a detailed debrief about the airplane, let's just say that they were pleasantly surprised that the reality didn't measure up to the hype that surrounded the Foxbat since that first footage was released in 1967. First, they discovered it was made of steel and not titanium. Then Belenko told him that the engines only had a service life of 150 hours, which amounted to around 70 or so sorties, which meant they didn't just need to be repaired, but totally replaced every month of operations. That was neither cost-effective or operationally efficient. Belenko also passed that if pilots actually reached Mach 3, the engines had to be pulled as soon as the airplane landed, and the actual max speed was closer to Mach 2.5, which is still impressive, but not Mach 3. Debriefers were pleased to learn from Belenko that the Smerch A radar had no look-down, shoot-down capability, a fact that ultimately caused the Air Force to shift its tactics from high-altitude ingress to low and resulted in the procurement of the B-1 Lancer. Belenko also related that originally the Foxbat had severe controllability issues, especially at supersonic speeds, and as a result, the vertical stabilizers and ventral fins were extended. The American inspectors also found the cockpit layout to be quirky, sort of a steampunk Jules Verne aesthetic, and somewhat random in terms of where the gauges were placed relative to each other. But overall, at some level, the American inspectors were impressed that the Foxbat could go so fast and fly so high with such low-tech components, a tribute to the Soviet just-get-it-done work ethic during the Cold War. After months of diplomatic back and forth, and once all the intelligence value was exhausted, the Japanese finally gave the MiG-25 back to Russia using a cargo ship. As a result of what was compromised, Russia redesigned the MiG-25 with a new radar, upgraded missiles, and more reliable, longer-lasting engines. And now that the Foxbat was no longer top secret, Russia began a foreign military sales program which wound up providing the MiG-25 to India, Syria, Iraq, and Libya. That sale to Iraq would ultimately wind up biting the United States during Desert Storm. As we discussed previously on the channel, Lieutenant Commander Scott Spiker had his Hornet shot down by a MiG-25 on the first night of the war. By the time production was stopped in 1984, the Soviet Union had produced almost 1,200 Foxbats, including the reconnaissance and strike variants. The MiG-25 remains the fastest tactical jet ever built. During its operational life with the Soviet Air Force, it set 29 world records, including a zoom climb to 123,000 feet. In contrast, the F-14 service ceiling was 50,000 feet, and we seldom, if ever, went that high. In the late 1970s, the Soviets took all the good ideas from the Foxbat and designed a next-generation interceptor that incorporated the latest technology and aeromechanic understanding, and the result was the MiG-31 Foxhound. The MiG-25 can be considered great both for its raw performance capabilities and its resonant effect on other airplane designs. And since now we've punted on speed and altitude with our 5th-generation fighters in lieu of stealth and all-aspect lethality, we'll probably never see another military airplane like it again. All right, look for your favorites in an upcoming episode of What Makes This Plane Great. So if you're not a subscriber, click the button now so you don't miss anything. That'll do it for this episode. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the Super Thanks or become a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.